Adam Bennett was 16 the summer his family took a trip to a quiet lakeside resort in the Adirondacks. His parents wanted a break from the noise of the city, and the resort, with its rustic cabins and secluded surroundings, seemed like the perfect escape. Adam wasn't thrilled. The place was practically empty, its guests mostly older couples or young families. For a teenager, it was the definition of boring. On their second day, Adam wandered the grounds alone, kicking at rocks and scuffing his sneakers against the dirt path leading to the lake. The main lodge loomed behind him, its faded paint and creaky shutters adding to the resort's out-of-time atmosphere. He passed by the playground, a small area with a rusty swing set and a slide that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was then he saw her. She was standing near the tree line just beyond the playground. At first, Adam thought she was one of the resort staff, a girl about his age, wearing a simple white sundress that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Her long black hair fell in waves over her shoulders, framing a face that seemed hauntingly beautiful yet strangely out of place. She didn't move, didn't wave or call out. She simply stood there, watching him. Adam hesitated, unsure if he should approach, but curiosity got the better of him. He raised his hand in a small wave, trying to appear casual. She didn't react, her expression unreadable. Something about her stillness unsettled him, but he pushed the thought aside and started walking toward her. As he got closer, Adam noticed there was something off about her face. From a distance, she had looked stunning, almost ethereal, but now her features seemed wrong. Her eyes were a little too wide, her lips too pale. Her smile, if it could even be called that, was stretched and faint, as though she was mimicking an expression she didn't fully understand. "Hey," Adam called out, trying to sound friendly. "Do you work here or something?" She tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes locked on his. She didn't speak, and the silence stretched uncomfortably between them. Adam stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure why he'd felt so compelled to come closer. "I'm Adam," he offered, his voice faltering. "Are you staying here too?" Still no answer. The girl turned abruptly and walked into the woods. Not just walked, ran. It was sudden, almost inhumanly quick, her white dress disappearing among the trees before Adam could react. He stood there, his heart pounding, staring after her. Something about the encounter left him feeling hollow, like he had just brushed against something he couldn't explain. That night, Adam sat on the porch of their cabin, replaying the moment in his mind. His parents were inside, laughing softly over a game of cards. The resort was quiet, the lake shimmering faintly under the moonlight. He tried to convince himself the girl had just been shy, maybe even a little strange, but nothing about her made sense. The next day, Adam was determined to see her again. He spent hours wandering the resort, circling the playground, and scanning the tree line. By late afternoon, he was beginning to think he'd imagined her entirely. But then, as he sat on a bench near the lake, he saw her again. She was standing by the water, her back to him. The sun glinted off her hair, and for a moment, she looked perfectly normal, like any other teenager enjoying the quiet of the lake. Adam's heart raced as he got up and walked toward her. "Hey, wait!" he called out, his voice breaking the stillness. She turned slowly, her head tilting just slightly as she looked at him. Up close, her face was even more unsettling than before. Her eyes seemed darker, almost bottomless, and her pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the fading sunlight. "Who are you?" Adam asked, his voice quieter now. "Are you here with your family?" She smiled then, but it wasn't comforting. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that felt practiced and unnatural. Adam's stomach churned. He took a step back, suddenly wishing he hadn't followed her. "I need to go," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. It was the first time she'd spoken, and her words sent a chill down his spine. Without waiting for a response, she turned and ran again, this time disappearing down the dirt path leading back toward the cabins. Adam didn't follow. He stood frozen, the weight of her presence lingering even after she was gone. That night, Adam's dreams were restless. He saw the girl's face, her dark eyes staring at him from the shadows. He woke up in a cold sweat, The image of her faint smile burned into his mind. The next morning, Adam was determined to find out who she was. He asked the staff at the front desk if a girl matching her description was staying at the resort. They gave him blank looks, shaking their heads. No one had seen anyone like her. Confused and frustrated, Adam decided to let it go. Maybe she was just a strange local girl who liked to wander the resort grounds. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. On their final day at the resort, as the family packed up the car, Adam stood by the edge of the parking lot, staring back toward the tree line. He didn't expect to see her again. But as they drove away, heading down the winding road that led back to the main highway, his heart stopped. There she was, standing at the edge of the forest, her white dress stark against the dark trees. The girl watched their car pass. Her head turned slowly, her eyes locked on Adam through the tinted window. His breath caught, and he turned to his parents. "Did you see her?" he asked, his voice trembling. "See who?" his mom replied, glancing in the rearview mirror. "The girl by the trees," Adam insisted, his chest tightening. "She was standing there, watching us." His parents exchanged a worried glance. "Honey, there's no one there," his mom said gently. Adam turned back, his face pressed against the glass. The road curved, and the forest disappeared from view. But the image of her standing there, her eyes following him, stayed with him long after they were gone. Even years later, Adam would think about her. The girl who didn't belong, whose smile never reached her eyes, and who seemed to exist just on the edge of reality. He would tell himself it was nothing, a strange encounter, a trick of his teenage mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. She had been real, and wherever she was now, he was certain she still remembered him. Ethan Hayes had always prided himself on being a rational man. A scientist by profession, he lived by facts, logic, and the certainty of what could be proven. But the events of one night in early spring would challenge everything he thought he understood. It began like any other evening. Ethan had stayed up late in his modest Denver apartment, working on a research paper. The soft glow of his laptop was the only light in the room, casting long shadows on the walls. As the clock crept past 2 a.m., exhaustion overtook him. He closed the laptop, set it on his nightstand, and climbed into bed. Outside, the city was eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an unnatural stillness. Ethan drifted into sleep almost immediately, his mind too tired to linger on the day's worries. But something woke him hours later. His eyes snapped open, and he was instantly aware of two things. He couldn't move, and the room felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, like it had been sucked of oxygen. He tried to lift his arms, but they were pinned to his sides. His legs refused to respond. Even his chest struggled to rise and fall, as though an invisible weight pressed down on him. Panic flared in his mind, but he couldn't scream. His mouth wouldn't obey him. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, desperate to make sense of what was happening. The familiar shapes of his dresser, his bookshelf, and the door to the hallway loomed in the dim light. Nothing seemed out of place, until he saw her. She was standing in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows. At first, she seemed like a child, small and delicate, with long black hair cascading over her shoulders. But as his eyes adjusted, the details sharpened. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were entirely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless voids that seemed to swallow the faint light. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. The girl didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him with those empty eyes. He wanted to convince himself she wasn't real, that she was a figment of his half-dreaming mind. But the weight on his chest, the chill in the air, and the unrelenting intensity of her gaze told him otherwise. Then she began to move. Her steps were slow, deliberate, yet eerily silent. Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floor as she approached the bed. Ethan's mind screamed for him to wake up, to do something, anything. But his body remained frozen. All he could do was watch as she drew closer. When she reached the foot of the bed, she stopped, her head tilted slightly as if studying him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a deafening drum in the silence. She lifted one hand, her fingers impossibly long, and pointed at him. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with an inexplicable malice. Ethan's chest tightened further, his lungs burning from the effort of shallow, restricted breaths. Her finger lowered, and for a moment, he thought it was over. But then she moved again, climbing onto the bed with an unnatural fluidity. She crawled up the length of the bed, her movements jerky and inhuman, like a spider stalking its prey. Ethan's eyes followed her, wide with terror. She stopped when her face was inches from his, her black eyes boring into his own. Her mouth opened slightly, and he thought she might speak, but no sound came out. Instead, her hands reached for his throat. The moment her cold fingers touched his skin, Ethan felt a pressure unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't just physical. It was as though she were draining something from him, pulling at his very essence. His vision began to blur, and darkness crept in at the edges. He closed his eyes, praying it would end, that he would wake up and find himself alone in his apartment, safe from whatever this was. Time stretched endlessly. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. Ethan gasped, his chest heaving as he sucked in air. He opened his eyes, half expecting to see her still hovering over him, but the room was empty. The weight on his body was gone, and he could move again. He bolted upright, his hands flying to his throat. There were no marks, no evidence of her touch, but the memory of it lingered, raw and undeniable. The room felt normal again. The oppressive heaviness was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the city waking outside. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there, his head in his hands. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Ethan tried to rationalize what had happened. Sleep paralysis, he told himself. He'd read about it before, how the brain could create vivid hallucinations during the transition between sleep and wakefulness, but the explanation felt hollow. He had never experienced anything like it before, and the clarity of the girl's face, the coldness of her touch, was too vivid to dismiss as a mere dream. Over the following weeks, Ethan couldn't shake the memory of that night. He started leaving the lights on when he went to bed, the soft glow of a lamp, his only comfort against the encroaching darkness. He even rearranged his furniture, moving the bed away from the corner where she had first appeared. But no matter what he did, the feeling of being watched persisted. One night, as he sat in bed scrolling through his phone, he noticed something strange. His reflection in the dark screen showed the room behind him, illuminated faintly by the lamp. At first it seemed normal, but then, in the corner of the reflection, he saw her. She was back. Ethan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The room was empty. He stared at the corner, his chest tightening with the same familiar dread. When he looked back at his phone, her reflection was gone. He didn't sleep that night. Over time, Ethan came to accept that she wasn't just a hallucination or a figment of his imagination. She was something else, something beyond his understanding. And though she hadn't returned in full form since that night, he knew she was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Ethan's life continued, but the events of that spring left an indelible mark on him. He avoided sleeping in total darkness, avoided mirrors at night, and never fully relaxed in his own home. The girl with the black eyes had taken something from him, not his life, but his peace, and deep down, he feared she would return to finish what she'd started.